She was supposed to start nursing school, but her own father sold her to a powerful stranger. What began as betrayal turned into something no one expected. Love, danger, sacrifice, and a truth that would shatter everything. Elena's journey from heartbreak to healing, from captivity to choosing her own future, will leave you breathless. Who is Damien, really? And why can't she walk away from the man who once owned her? Where are you watching from? If you love stories filled with emotion, drama, and redemption, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to hear the full story. You won't want to miss this. Elena Moore sat at the edge of her narrow bed, the springs creaking softly beneath her as she clutched a letter between trembling fingers. The soft orange glow from her bedside lamp bathed the worn walls of her room, casting long shadows across peeling paint and faded posters from her childhood. But none of that mattered right now. The letter, crisp, white, and stamped with the royal blue crest of Arcadia Medical University, felt like a golden ticket in her hands. She had read it over a dozen times already, yet the words still made her breath catch, and her heart thunder in her chest. "We are pleased to inform you." Pleased? That was an understatement. After 3 rejections, 2 interviews that ended in tears, and nearly 4 years of working double shifts at the diner just to afford her application fees, Elena had finally done it. She had made it. A quiet laugh slipped from her lips, half disbelief, half joy, and she clutched the letter tighter, pressing it against her chest as if afraid it might vanish. She whispered a thank you under her breath, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to the universe or to her mother, who had died when Elena was just 12, leaving her in the care of Calvin Moore, the man who had never once let her feel truly fatherless. Calvin was a mechanic, gritty, calloused, and quiet. He rarely showed emotion, but he had always shown up. He made sure she had shoes for school, a warm coat in the winter, and dinner on the table, even if he didn't eat. And now, this letter was just as much for him as it was for her. She was going to make him proud. Elena stood, holding the letter delicately, like a sacred thing, and turned toward the small kitchen where he was likely finishing the leftover stew from lunch. But before she could take a step, a firm knock rattled the front door. She frowned. It was nearly 9 p.m., and they rarely had visitors, especially not unannounced. "Elena," her stepfather's voice called, gruff but quiet. "We're going out." She blinked, surprised. "Now, where?" "I'll explain in the car," he said, already grabbing his faded brown jacket from the hook. She glanced down at her letter and then quickly tucked it back into its envelope, placing it carefully on the bed. She slipped on her sneakers, grabbed her crossbody bag, and followed him out into the night. The air was cool, and the streetlights buzzed overhead. Their neighborhood, small, working class, and dimly lit, had always felt safe to Elena. Familiar, but something about tonight felt different. They didn't speak much on the walk to the corner where the ride was waiting. A sleek black car, definitely not a taxi, idled at the curb. Calvin opened the door for her without a word. As she slid inside, Elena cast a quick glance at her stepfather. There was a strange look on his face. Something between nervousness and resignation. The silence in the car was thick. They drove for nearly 40 minutes, the city lights giving way to wider streets and fancier neighborhoods. Elena stared out the window as glittering high-rises turned into gated estates, each mansion larger and more extravagant than the last. "Calvin," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper.
"Where are we going?"
He hesitated. "To meet someone. Someone who can help." "With what?" He didn't answer. Her stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The car turned down a long private drive, and at the end stood a towering iron gate with golden lettering across the top. The Cross Estate. Elena felt her heartbeat spike. Damien Cross. The name rang in her ears like an echo from a warning she hadn't yet understood. The iron gates opened slowly with a mechanical hum, revealing a driveway paved with cobblestone and lined with perfectly trimmed hedges that looked like they'd been sculpted by hand. Elena sat frozen, her fingers curled around the strap of her bag, eyes wide as the car crept forward through the grand entrance. The mansion that rose before her looked like it had been pulled from the pages of a royal fairy tale, massive, elegant, and intimidating. Cream-colored stone, tall arched windows, columns that reached toward the heavens, and a fountain in the shape of a lion in the middle of the circular driveway. Water trickled steadily from its jaws like it was bored of luxury. She swallowed hard. This was no ordinary home. Whoever lived here was rich beyond her imagination, and dangerous enough to make the air feel thicker with every passing second. The car came to a slow stop. Calvin stepped out first, moving stiffly, like his limbs were weighed down by something more than fatigue. Elena followed, planting her feet onto the cool stone. The house loomed above her like a cathedral, its silent promise of power sinking into her skin. The front doors, tall, dark, and polished, swung open before they could even knock. A man in a black suit stood in the entryway, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Moore," he greeted, then turned his gaze to Elena. They were led into a cavernous foyer where a chandelier the size of her entire living room sparkled above them. Everything smelled of expensive cologne, lemon oil, and something metallic beneath the surface. Some sharp. Elena felt out of place instantly, like a smudge on a masterpiece. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the marble floor, and she shrank slightly, glancing at her stepfather for some kind of reassurance. But Calvin was silent, his jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. They entered a lounge that screamed opulence. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, velvet armchairs, a fireplace framed in black marble, and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. Two men in black suits stood at the far wall, arms crossed, silent and imposing. Bodyguards. Elena knew it instinctively. These weren't employees. These weren't employees. They were barriers. Sentinels. "Please, sit." The man in the suit gestured to a low leather couch. Elena perched at the edge, her knees together, her bag clutched tight in her lap. Calvin sat beside her, but not close enough to offer comfort. The silence in the room was almost a character itself. Thick, knowing, and strangely expectant. Then footsteps echoed from beyond the hallway. She turned toward the sound, and her breath caught. A man stepped into the room, tall and striking, dressed in a charcoal gray shirt rolled at the sleeves, dark pants, and no tie. His presence filled the room instantly, not just because of his height or the tailored fit of his clothes, but because of something far less tangible. The confidence in his stride, the control in his eyes, the cold calculation on his face. Damien Cross. Elena had never seen him before, but she knew. There was no mistaking a man like this. His gaze swept over her quickly, unreadable. Then, he moved to the glass coffee table and dropped a sleek black briefcase onto its surface. The click of the latches echoed in the quiet. He opened it. Elena's eyes widened. Stacks of money. Crisp, bound, intimidating. More money than she'd ever seen in her life. 20 million Naira. She blinked, confused, her heart starting to race. Why was he showing them this? She turned to her stepfather, but his face had gone pale, his shoulders rigid. "Calvin?" she whispered. He didn't answer. She had never felt more alone. Calvin's hands trembled as he leaned forward, his gaze locked on the briefcase like it held more than just money, like it held salvation. Elena watched him, her heart thudding in her chest, her throat suddenly dry. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. She could feel it in the way his breathing had changed, in the way his fingers kept twitching against his knees. She reached out, gently touching his arm. "Dad," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "What is this?" He didn't look at her, didn't even blink. Then, like a dam breaking, tears began to roll down his face. Elena froze. In her entire life, she had never seen Calvin cry. Not when they were evicted from their first apartment. Not when her mother died. Not even when he worked 20-hour shifts just to put food on their table. He was steel, solid, unshakable. But now, he looked like a man shattered. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't want it to be like this." Elena's stomach twisted violently.
What do you mean? Like what?
Calvin turned to her then, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a kind of sorrow that pierced her soul. "You have to forgive me, Elena. Please." She sat up straighter, panic beginning to rise in her chest. "For what?" Damien's voice cut through the air like a blade. "For selling you to me." The words didn't register at first. They felt too foreign, too absurd, too impossible. Elena blinked slowly, sure she had misheard. "What?" she breathed. Calvin flinched, his head bowing lower, shoulders trembling. I owed money," he rasped. "Too much. I was drowning. And when I came here for help, he said he didn't give loans. He said he didn't give loans. He said he didn't give loans. He said he only made deals. He just... This is the deal." Elena stood suddenly, the blood draining from her face. "You're joking," she said, her voice shaking. "You're joking, right? This is some kind of horrible, twisted prank." But Damien wasn't laughing. He was watching her calmly from where he stood, his arms folded across his chest. "Your stepfather offered you," he said simply. "And I accepted." Elena took a step back, as if the words had physically struck her. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible. He would never." "I had no choice," Calvin croaked. "I was going to lose the house, the garage, everything. I was trying to protect you, to give you a future. By giving me away like property," her voice cracked like glass. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I thought he would just help with your tuition. I didn't know what he really..." "Enough." Damien's voice was low, bored even. "The deal is done. The papers are signed. The money has changed hands. She's mine now." The finality in his voice sent a chill racing down Elena's spine. "No," she whispered, backing away. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I'm not yours." But two of the guards moved, stepping forward as if on cue. One of them reached out toward her. "Don't touch!" Mishi screamed, spinning toward Calvin. "Tell them to stop! Please, Dad! Please!" But he couldn't meet her eyes. His face was soaked in tears, his hands limp in his lap. "Elena," Damien said, his voice smooth and cold, "your fight is with him, not with me." She turned to run, but the guards were faster. Hands gripped her arms, iron-like. She thrashed wildly, screaming, kicking, but it was no use. She was outnumbered, outmatched. As they dragged her toward the grand staircase, Elena's eyes locked with her stepfather's one last time. "You were supposed to protect me," she sobbed. And he said nothing. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy finality that made Elena's knees buckle. She stumbled backward until the edge of the bed caught her and sent her collapsing onto it, her chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. The room was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings, golden drapes, plush carpet that muffled her footsteps, and a chandelier that glittered like frozen stars. But none of it mattered. None of it mattered. None of it felt real. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a cage. A gilded prison. She bolted to the door, her palms slick with sweat as she twisted the handle. It didn't budge. She yanked harder, panic rising in her throat like bile. Still nothing. Locked. "No, no, no," she whispered, slamming her palm against the door. "Let me out. Somebody, please." Silence. She spun around, eyes darting across the room. There were no cameras she could see, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Every inch of the space felt staged, perfectly designed to lull her into submission. A vanity table sat in the corner, its surface covered with high-end beauty products she'd only seen in magazines. A walk-in closet stood half open, revealing rows of designer clothes in her exact size. It made her stomach turn. She clutched her arms around herself, trying to slow her breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This had to be a dream. Some kind of nightmare. But every sensation, the sting of betrayal, the ache in her chest, the locked door behind her, was horrifyingly real. A soft creak made her flinch. She looked up, and there he was. Damien Cross, standing just outside the doorway, holding something in his hand. He didn't say a word, just looked at her for a long, unreadable moment before tossing the envelope onto the floor. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "A letter," he said coolly, "from your stepfather." Then the door closed again with a soft click. Elena stared at the envelope like it might explode. Slowly, cautiously, she crossed the room and picked it up. Her name was written in Calvin's familiar, shaky handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it and began to read. "My dearest Elena, I know you hate me. I deserve it. There are no words to explain what I've done. But please, let me try. I was desperate. The bills, the debt. I made a promise to your mother before she died that I'd take care of you, give you the life she never got. But I failed her. I failed her. I failed her. You deserve more than what I ever had to offer. And there's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago. I'm not your biological father. I raised you. I loved you. But by blood you were never mine. Your real father. I could never tell you who he was. He wasn't safe. It still isn't. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. No matter what happens, know that I will always love you. Forever, Calvin, Calvin." The letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. Her vision blurred, her heart squeezed in her chest. Not her real father. He'd sold her, lied to her. And now, even the only truth she thought she had, that he was her family. Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, the sobs hitting her before she could hold them back. Her body shook, her world spinning faster than she could keep up with. And then everything went black. She collapsed onto the bed, unconscious. Somewhere outside her door, Damien Cross stood in silence, listening. But for once, even he didn't have the words. Elena lay still on the enormous bed, her breathing shallow, lashes resting against flushed cheeks as sunlight filtered through the tall windows, painting gold across her skin. She'd been unconscious for nearly a full day. The house had quieted since her collapse, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Outside the bedroom door, Damien Cross sat in an armchair, one leg crossed over the other, his elbow resting on the armrest, fingers tapping an erratic rhythm. He hadn't left that spot since the moment one of the maids had found her crumpled on the floor. Now, he watched her through the slightly open door, not like a man who owned her, but like a man trying to make sense of something he couldn't control. She was beautiful. He had noticed that the first time Calvin brought her in. But beauty meant nothing to him. He'd seen beautiful women come and go like storms. They had smiled, begged, seduced, manipulated. But this one, Elena Moore, with her fury and fear, her loyalty and honesty, was something else entirely. He exhaled, dragging a hand through his tousled dark hair. This hadn't been part of the plan. When Calvin Moore had walked into his office weeks ago, desperate and trembling, Damien had almost dismissed him on sight. But then the man had said something that piqued his interest. "She's not just my daughter. She's my entire life. If you help me, I'll give you my everything." Damien had leaned back in his chair, curiosity tugging at him. "Your everything?" Calvin had nodded, swallowing hard. "My daughter, Elena. She's bright, hardworking, innocent. She's good. She deserves better than what I've given her." Damien had heard those kinds of speeches before. Father figures bargaining with flesh and blood. It usually disgusted him. But then Calvin had pulled out a worn photo album, flipping it open to a picture of Elena in her graduation gown, smiling like the world still held promise. Something inside Damien had shifted. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed untouched by cruelty. Or maybe it was the fact that she looked like someone he hadn't seen in a decade. Eve, his twin sister. The resemblance was uncanny. Same deep brown eyes, same high cheekbones, same stubborn set of the jaw. But where Eve had been reckless, wild, and untamable, Elena was different, gentler, grounded, and filled with a quiet kind of fire. Eve had died in Italy 10 years ago, during a skydiving accident. One wrong wind current, one faulty parachute. Damien had been 22. He remembered the call, the panic, the silence that followed. He hadn't spoken to anyone for 3 days. And when his mother fell into a coma from the grief, he had buried the softer part of himself with his sister. Until now. Until this girl. Damien's jaw tensed as he stood slowly, pushing the door open further. Elena hadn't moved. Her long hair spread across the pillow like a halo. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers curled gently, as if she were dreaming of a time before this place. Before him. He walked to the edge of the bed and sat down carefully, as though afraid to wake her. He wasn't supposed to care. But as he looked at her, he realized something terrifying. He did. He reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of hair from her face, letting his fingertips linger for just a second longer than he should have. Her skin was warm, real, and yet somehow untouchable. "You weren't supposed to matter," he murmured, his voice low, conflicted. "But you do." And that was the most dangerous truth of all. Elena's eyelids fluttered open slowly, the sunlight cutting across her vision like a blade. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The silk sheets beneath her, the scent of lavender in the air, the gold-accented walls. It all felt foreign, like waking up in a stranger's dream. Then the memories slammed into her like a truck. The briefcase. the betrayal. Her stepfather's tear-streaked face, Damien's voice declaring her as his property. She sat up too fast, her breath catching in her throat. The room spun briefly before steadying. She wasn't dreaming. Panic curled tight in her stomach as she scanned the room. The door was closed but not locked. Warily, she slid off the bed and padded barefoot across the marble floor. She twisted the handle. It turned. She stepped into the hallway, unsure of whether she should feel relief or fear. Everything was quiet. The air smelled of citrus, polish, and expensive silence. She followed the corridor slowly, her senses on high alert, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a gunshot in her ears. She passed a set of tall windows and caught a glimpse of the estate grounds below. Manicured gardens, a stone fountain shaped like a phoenix, and an infinity pool that shimmered under the sun. This wasn't a home. It was a kingdom. And Damien Cross was its king. A sudden movement down the hall made her flinch. A man stepped out of a side room, tall, muscular, with the kind of stillness that came from years of violence. One of Damien's bodyguards. He glanced at her but said nothing, merely gave a slight nod before continuing down the opposite direction. Elena's pulse raced. She wandered until she found the kitchen, drawn by the scent of fresh bread and something buttery. There, she met an older woman with soft gray curls tucked under a head wrap and warm brown eyes. "You must be hungry," the woman said gently, her voice rich with a calming cadence. "I'm Miriam. Mr. Cross asked me to make sure you eat." Elena stared at her, unsure of how to respond. But her stomach answered for her, growling loudly enough to make her cheeks flush. Miriam smiled kindly and set a plate down in front of her. Scrambled eggs, toast, avocado slices, and a tall glass of orange juice. Elena ate in silence, the food tasting like something from another world. She'd just finished the last bite when a kitchen door burst open. Damien Cross walked in, his shirt rolled to his elbows, his jaw sharp with tension. But what startled her most was the blood. It stained his shirt, his arm, and a thin gash ran down his temple. "Jason!" Miriam gasped, rushing forward. "You're bleeding." "I'm fine," Damien muttered, brushing past her with a dismissive hand. But Elena was already on her feet, heart hammering. "What happened to you?" He glanced at her, his eyes briefly softening at the sight of her upright, alert, concerned. "Just a small issue at one of the warehouses. It's under control." "That doesn't look small," she said, eyeing the deep cut in his bicep. He looked at her again, something unreadable in his gaze. "I can help you," she said, surprising even herself. Miriam blinked. "You know how to stitch." Elena nodded slowly. "My mom was a nurse. I learned a lot from watching her. I was supposed to start nursing school." Damien hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Upstairs. My room." Minutes later, she was kneeling beside him in his bedroom, a first aid kit open between them. She cleaned the wound, stitched it carefully, ignoring the sharp lines of his muscles and the way his eyes never left her face. "You're good at this," he murmured, voice low. She didn't answer, but as she tied the final knot and wiped the blood away, something strange passed between them. Something neither of them could name, but both of them felt. That night, Elena sat quietly in the corner of Damien's massive bedroom, her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. She hadn't planned to stay. She had stitched his wound, packed the kit away, and stood up to leave. But then he had whispered, "Just stay. For tonight." Something about his voice, low, almost pleading, had stopped her in her tracks. Against all logic, She sat back down. Now, as the moonlight spilled through the tall windows, bathing the room in silver, she listened to the soft, even rhythm of his breathing. Damien was asleep, his body finally at rest, after hours of tension and pain. Elena didn't know what to make of the strange comfort she felt in this moment. She should be afraid. She was afraid. But under the fear, something else pulsed. Confusion, curiosity, and a flicker of something she didn't want to name. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her under too. Her head dipped forward, her body giving in, and when she awoke, she felt a heavy warmth at her back. A strong arm wrapped around her waist. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned her head to look over her shoulder. Damien was curled behind her, still asleep, his hand resting lightly on her stomach. He looked different in sleep. Less sharp, less cruel, almost human. She tried to shift away, but his grip tightened instinctively. "I'm glad you didn't try to strangle me in my sleep," he murmured, his voice still laced with sleep. She stiffened. "You're awake." "Been awake," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Didn't want to scare you." "You're already terrifying," she muttered. He chuckled quietly, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. Elena pulled away fully and sat up, crossing her arms. "You shouldn't be this close to me," she said. "Not after everything." He sat up too, resting back on his hands.
You kissed me first, remember?
"I stitched your wound," she snapped. "That doesn't give you the right to—" He leaned in slightly, his eyes darkening. "You kissed me. On the plane." Her cheeks flushed. That was a mistake. Was it? Was it? His voice dropped, velvet and dangerous. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She hated how his presence affected her. Hated that his gaze could melt her defiance like ice under a flame. Then he said something she didn't expect. "Do you know why I took you from Calvin?" Elena blinked. "To punish him. Because you needed leverage." He shook his head slowly, jaw clenched. "Because you look exactly like her." A chill spread across her skin. "Like who?" He hesitated for the first time. His voice, when it came, was quieter. "My twin sister, Eve." Elena's breath caught. She died in Italy 10 years ago. Skydiving accident. She was fearless. Too fearless. He paused, eyes unfocused, distant. "You have her eyes. Her stubbornness. Her fire." Elena couldn't speak. The room felt heavier now. "When Calvin showed me your photo," he continued, "it was like seeing a ghost. I knew I shouldn't have accepted, but I couldn't stop myself." She stood slowly, arms still crossed over her chest. "So that's what I am. A memory? A replacement for someone you lost?" "No." His voice hardened. "You're more than that. I didn't expect you to be like this. I didn't expect to care." Her heart thudded. "And yet," she said coldly, "you still keep me here like a prisoner." Damien stepped closer. "If you really want to leave, Elena, I won't stop you. When we return to Lagos, you're free to go." She froze. The words hung in the air like a strange kind of miracle. "You mean it?" He nodded. "I don't say things I don't mean." Relief flooded her chest, but with it came something else. A pang she didn't understand. She turned away, unsure whether to smile or cry. For the first time, she saw a door opening. And yet, the thought of walking away hurt more than she expected. The morning light slipped through the linen curtains like golden threads, casting a gentle glow over the room. Elena stirred beneath the soft covers, her bare skin still tingling from the night before. Damien's arm was wrapped around her waist, his chest pressed lightly against her back, his breath warm against her shoulder. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the feeling. Safe, wanted, full. She had never imagined this. Him could feel like home, even for a second. But when she slipped out of bed and into the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror, and guilt clenched in her chest. What had she done? What were they becoming? No matter how gentle Damien had been, no matter the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, she couldn't forget how this had all started. She hadn't come here by choice. By the time she stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel around herself, Damien was already dressed in a crisp black button-down, pacing slowly by the window, phone pressed to his ear. "Handle it, discreetly," he was saying, his voice calm but firm. "And send me the records. I want every name, every detail." When he hung up, she asked, "Business?" He turned, his gaze sweeping over her towel-clad form with quiet heat, but his expression remained composed. "Sort of. I hired someone, a private investigator." Her brow furrowed. "For what?" He stepped closer, his eyes unreadable. "To find your real father." Her breath caught. "What?" Damien nodded. "I wanted to know who he was. Not the man who sold you to me. Your real father." She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, and he hesitated, then pulled a file from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. A military portrait stared back at her. A strong jaw, deep-set eyes, a uniform with medals. "Colonel Gabriel Ako," Damien said quietly. He was a decorated officer in the Nigerian army. Brave, respected. Elena traced the photograph with a fingertip. He died 5 years ago, Damien said. In a border conflict. He never even knew you were alive. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "So I've been fatherless this whole time," she whispered. "One man lied to me, and the other never got the chance." Damien sat beside her, silent for a moment. Then he pulled out another envelope. "There's more." She opened it slowly. Her eyes widened. Her nursing school acceptance letter, with confirmation of full payment and enrollment. "I paid the fees. Set everything up," he said. "When the semester starts, you're in. No strings. No more cages." Elena stared at the letter, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve your future," Damien said, voice low. "And because I'm tired of stealing things from people I care about." Tears streamed freely down her cheeks now. She clutched the letter against her chest. She thought was lost, suddenly within reach again. "You're not the man I thought you were," she whispered. "I'm not sure who I am anymore," he replied. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the rustle of wind against the vineyard leaves, her mind spinning. Everything had changed, so fast, so deeply. Damien had started as a captor, a terrifying force she couldn't escape. But now he was the man who had found her father's name, who had given her a second chance at life, who had held her like she was something sacred. He hadn't said it aloud, but she could feel it in every glance, every unspoken gesture. He loved her. And worse, she was beginning to love him too. The realization terrified her. Love meant surrender. Love meant risk. Love meant that when he hurt, she would hurt too. But as she turned in the bed and saw him watching her from the doorway, arms crossed, a tired smile on his lips, she knew it was too late. She was already his. And Somehow, impossibly, he was already hers. The weeks that followed passed like something out of a dream, one so vivid and surreal that Elena often woke up expecting it to vanish. But it didn't. Every morning, she rolled over to find Damien already awake, propped on an elbow, watching her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And every evening, after her long hours at school, she came home to his quiet presence in the kitchen or his soft voice asking how her day went, as if they'd always belonged in each other's lives. She had started nursing school just as the semester opened, slipping into the role with a natural ease that surprised even her. The early mornings, the endless lectures, the practicals that left her exhausted, all of it made her feel alive. She was building something, finally. Something she had dreamed of for so long, it almost felt like fiction. But what made it real was Damien. He had kept his word. He hadn't tried to control her. He hadn't demanded anything in return. He simply supported her, fully, quietly, constantly. The man who once ruled everything through fear now showed up at her campus gates with her favorite pastries. He didn't walk her to class. He waited in the car like a ghost, a shadow, a protector. The other students whispered about the expensive car and the man in the black suit inside it. They called him her mysterious boyfriend. No one knew the truth. Not fully. Not yet. And Elena didn't bother to correct them. At home, their love grew not with grand declarations, but with small, deliberate moments. The way he always refilled her water glass without asking. The way she learned to soothe the tension in his shoulders after long strategy calls with his business partners. The way they both knew when to speak and when to just be. One evening, after a long shift at her clinical placement, she came home to find the entire garden behind the villa lit with soft fairy lights. A table for two had been set beneath the archway, candles flickering, wine already poured. He was standing beside it, hands in his pockets, that rare, boyish smile tugging at his lips. "What's this?" she asked, unable to hide her grin. "You finished your first month," he said. "Top of your class. I thought that deserved a little celebration." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both, falling into his arms as the warm evening wrapped around them. Later that night, as they lay tangled in sheets and skin, her head resting on his chest, she whispered into the darkness, "I never thought I could feel safe again." His arm tightened around her. "I never thought I deserved someone like you." She propped herself up to look at him. "Damien, you don't have to keep proving anything." His gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, it looked like he might cry. But instead, he kissed her slowly, deeply, and the weight of everything unspoken passed between them. It wasn't perfect. They still fought. About stupid things, mostly. Her tendency to forget breakfast. His habit of working until 3 a.m. But the fights were different now. Softer. Full of care. Because now, they fought for each other. Not against each other. Elena had gone from being his prisoner to becoming his partner, his lover, his peace. And Damien. Well, she was still feared by the world, still powerful and dangerous in ways she couldn't always understand. But when he came home to her, all of that melted away. With her, he was just a man who had loved and lost too much, and now finally found someone who made him want to live again. They had built something neither of them expected, something fragile, beautiful, and real. And neither of them were willing to let it go. It had been 3 months since Elena started nursing school, and each day brought her closer to the future she'd once believed was forever out of reach. Life had settled into a rhythm, one she never dared to hope for when she first set foot inside Damien's world. But despite the peace that had grown between them, despite the way his touch now felt like home and his presence like safety, she could sense something lingering beneath the surface, something unfinished. It began with whispers, a slip of conversation she overheard between Damien and Felix on the terrace. The name Calvin floated through the air like poison, a name she hadn't heard in a long time, but one she could never forget. The man who had claimed to be her father, the man who sold her. That night, she waited until Damien returned to the bedroom. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set like stone. "Is something wrong?" she asked, watching him from the bed. He hesitated. Then, finally, Calvin's back in Lagos. Her stomach turned. What does he want now? Damien looked away, his voice low. Money. Again. He's been trying to leverage your story, your name, threatening to sell it to the press. Elena sat up straighter, a chill crawling up her spine. Why would anyone care? "You're tied to me now," he said, "and my enemies are always looking for a weakness." She swallowed hard. "So, I'm your weakness?" "No," he said immediately, turning to face her. "You're the reason I've survived this long." The way he said it made her chest ache. But something inside her had already shifted. She had worked too hard, endured too much to let Calvin's shadow creep back into her life. "I want to confront him," she said, surprising even herself. Damien froze. "Absolutely not. I need to see him, to say it to his face, that he doesn't own me anymore." He crossed the room, kneeling in front of her, gripping her hands tightly. "Elena, he's not like before. He's desperate, dangerous." "So am I," she said quietly. There was a long pause, a war waging behind his eyes. Finally, with great reluctance, he nodded. "Then, we do it my way." 2 days later, they returned to Lagos. The city felt different now, brighter, less suffocating. But the memory of everything she had endured here clung to her like a second skin. They met Calvin in a quiet, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. Neutral ground. Felix and another guard stood close by, guns hidden but ready. Elena walked in ahead of Damien, her chin high. Calvin was waiting, wearing a smirk that made her stomach turn. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look at you, all grown up. Dressed like you've made it." "I have made it," she said coldly, "despite you." His eyes narrowed. "Is that gratitude I hear?" "Gratitude," she echoed, "for selling me like property." "You got a better life, didn't you?" Calvin snapped. "You think any of that would have been possible if I hadn't made that deal?" Elena stepped closer. "You didn't give me a better life. Damien did. I did. You just sold your silence." For a split second, something flickered in Calvin's expression. Shame, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Why are you here, Elena?" he said. "What do you want?" She took a breath. "To say this face to face. You're done. You have no power over me. No more money. No more games. You're nothing to me." Calvin laughed bitterly. "You think this man loves you? He owns you, just like I did." "No," Damien said, stepping forward now, his voice deadly calm. "I don't own her. I love her. That's the difference." Calvin sneered. "You're weak, oh puta." Damien's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, I'm smart enough to know a man like you will never stop until someone makes you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. "Here's your silence." Calvin's eyes dropped to the documents, sealed court orders, financial settlements, and a non-disclosure agreement that left him legally muzzled. "You sign this," Damien said, "and you disappear. Or I bury you in ways you can't imagine." Calvin looked between the two of them, realizing he had lost. He signed. That night, back at the estate, Elena stood on the balcony, the Lagos skyline glittering in the distance. Damien joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Are you okay?" he asked. She leaned back into him. "I think I am." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The soft hum of the private jet filled the silence as it soared above the clouds, leaving Lagos behind once more. Elena sat by the window, her fingers pressed lightly against the cool glass, eyes watching the shifting sky. Beside her, Damien rested with his head tilted back, eyes closed, though she knew he wasn't sleeping. Not really. He'd barely slept at all in the days since they'd confronted Calvin. The relief of cutting ties with the man who'd once held power over her had been overwhelming, but not nearly as overwhelming as what came next. Love. Real, raw, undeniable love. It had crept in slowly, like sunlight through a crack, until it filled every dark space between them. Until it became the one thing neither of them could ignore anymore. Back in Tuscany, the air felt different, lighter, like the weight they'd both carried for so long had finally begun to lift. The moment they stepped into the villa, Elena knew this was no longer just Damien's estate. It was their home. She could feel it in the way he looked at her now. Not as something he needed to control, or protect, or prove himself to, but as someone he cherished. His equal. His heart. And she felt it too. The next few weeks unfolded like a love story neither of them ever thought they'd get to live. When she came home from school, Damien was always there, sometimes in the garden, sometimes reading quietly in the study, sometimes just waiting in the kitchen with a glass of wine and that crooked smile that made her knees weak. They talked, laughed, fell asleep in each other's arms. They learned how to exist not just as two broken souls bound by circumstance, but as two people building a life together. And then one morning, everything changed again. Elena had been feeling strange. Nothing alarming, just tired, nauseous in the mornings, a little dizzy during clinicals. She blamed it on stress, on lack of sleep, on the intensity of balancing school and love and recovery from everything she'd been through. But Madame Gianna, the sweet Italian housekeeper who had taken to fussing over her like a daughter, gave her a look one afternoon and said, "Cara Maya, I've seen that look before. You should take a test." Elena blinked.
A test.
Gianna raised a brow, and Lena's heart stuttered. An hour later, she sat on the bathroom floor, a white stick clutched in her trembling hands, the two pink lines staring back at her like thunder. Pregnant. Pregnant. She was pregnant. Her breath came in shallow gasps. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. What would this change? Would Damien be angry? Afraid, would it ruin everything they had fought so hard to build? She barely heard the knock at the door. Elena. Damien's voice was soft, concerned. "You've been in there a while." She couldn't answer. She didn't know how. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Damien stepped inside. The moment his eyes fell on the test in her hands, his breath caught. He knelt slowly beside her. "Is it?" She nodded, unable to speak. He reached out, gently taking the test from her hand, staring at it as though it held the secrets of the universe. Then, with a quiet, trembling laugh, he looked up at her. "We're having a baby." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't know if you're happy or terrified." He let out a breath, pulling her into his arms.
I can move,
He whispered, but mostly. She laughed through her tears, burying her face in his chest. Me too. The next few days were a blur of preparation and wonder. Damien cleared his schedule. Felix brought in doctors. Gianna cried 3 times. And Elena, she began to dream again. This time, her dream didn't end with a career, or even with love. It ended with a family. On the night of her final exam, she came home to find Damien waiting at the door, dressed in black slacks and a crisp white shirt, holding a small velvet box. Her breath caught. He didn't wait for a speech. He just knelt, right there in the entryway, and opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring, a small diamond, cradled at the center like a promise. "I didn't just fall in love with you, Elena," he said. "You changed everything I am. You gave me back my humanity. You gave me back my humanity. You gave me something I never thought I deserved. A future? Will you marry me?" She nodded, tears already falling. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. That night, as they lay in bed, her hand resting over her belly, his fingers laced with hers, Elena looked up at the man who had once been her captor, now her protector, her lover, the father of her child. And soon, her husband. She whispered into the quiet, "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." And Damien, his lips against her forehead, replied, "So am I." Life lesson. Elena and Damien's journey teaches us that healing doesn't always come from the places we expect. Sometimes it begins in the darkest corners where pain, betrayal, and brokenness dwell. But with time, patience, and the courage to face one another's wounds, even the most shattered souls can rebuild something beautiful. This story is about transformation, not just from fear to freedom, but from survival to love. Damien, a man hardened by loss and power, learned that true strength lies in vulnerability. And Elena, who was once stripped of choice and trust, discovered that her past did not define her future. Together, they proved that redemption is possible, not through grand gestures or perfection, but through quiet acts of care, honesty, and sacrifice. At its heart, this story reminds us that love, real love, is not about possession or control. It's about giving someone the space to grow, the safety to be seen, and the strength to believe in themselves again. Whether born from chaos or built over time, love that heals is the most powerful kind of all. So no matter where life takes you, never forget. Your worth is not measured by your past, but by the future you choose to create. And sometimes, the most unexpected people can become your home. If you've made it this far, thank you for being part of this journey. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know. And if you enjoy emotional, dramatic love stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe, give this a like, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means everything.